The sound that ended my world wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a scream. It was the dry scrape of cheap plastic wheels dragging across the hardwood floor of my hallway. That sound. Small. Vulgar. Final. I looked up from my book and there she was. Letitia, my only daughter, shaking raindrops off a designer coat with a look of irritation, as if the sky itself had offended her. She didn't remove her muddy shoes. She left a trail of brown footprints across the Persian rug that Anselmo and I had bought on our 20th anniversary. The same rug I scrubbed on my knees every Saturday morning for 30 years. Mom, I don't have much time. I left the car in a no-parking zone, she said, not looking at me. Her eyes fixed on some vague point above my head, like I was a smudge on the wall rather than her mother. I brought the big red suitcase. Pack the essentials. A van is coming for you tomorrow morning. The world stopped. Just like that. Without warning, without ceremony, the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. My name is Prudentia. I am 78 years old, and until that moment, I believed those years had been well spent, well suffered, and well managed. I am not a helpless widow who weeps in corners. I am a married woman. My husband, Anselmo, was sleeping in the room next door, deep inside that thick fog that Alzheimer's had lent him to disconnect him from the world. We had been together 54 years. He had been my hands, and I had been his head in the hardware business we built from nothing. One screw, one bolt, one honest transaction at a time, until it became the most trusted shop in the neighborhood. A van? I asked. My voice came out strangely steady, stripped of the trembling I felt in my knees. I was still sitting in my reading chair, a closed history book on my lap. I did not stand up. Letitia sighed. That dramatic, theatrical sigh she had perfected since adolescence, the one she used when I asked her to clean her room. Yes, Mom. A van from the care center. I arranged everything. It's the best thing for you both. Well, for you and Dad. They'll take him to the intensive care ward, and you'll be in the residential area. She finally turned to face me, but her gaze slid over me like oil over water. The facility is lovely, Mom. It has a garden. A very big garden where you can walk. It has a garden. Those 3 words detonated inside my skull with a violence I cannot fully describe. As if my entire life, the sacrifices, the house we built with Anselmo's sweat and my sleepless calculations, the 40 years of mornings that smelled like coffee and motor oil and honest work, could be traded in for a patch of badly trimmed grass in a place that smelled of disinfectant and boiled soup. And who told you I wanted a garden, Letitia? I replied, feeling the heat climb my neck. Not shame. Not sadness. Something older, deeper. A volcanic anger I had been sitting on for years. Mom, please don't start, she said, pulling out her phone and scrolling without looking up. You're not in a position to maintain this house on your own, and Dad is too much work. It's irresponsible for you two to stay here alone. She paused. And in that pause, I saw the wolf's face finally slip out from under the sheep's skin. The house needs maintenance, and I don't have money to keep fixing leaks. It's better to sell it soon. I've already spoken to someone. There it was. The naked, cruel truth. Not concern for my health. Not worry about Anselmo. It was the bricks. The land. The privileged location of our home in a neighborhood that had tripled in value over the decades. Letitia, who had always lived beyond her means, drowning in debts she patched with other debts, no longer saw us as her parents. She saw us as 2 obstacles of flesh and bone standing between her and her advance inheritance. Your father is not moving from his bed, I said, closing the book with a firm snap. Mom, the decision is made. She crossed her arms. I have the power of attorney Dad signed when he started getting sick. Remember. I'm his legal guardian in case of incapacity. And you, well, you can't stay here alone without him. Legally, I can decide what's best for the family estate. I looked at her. Really looked. I searched her face for some trace of the little girl whose hair I used to braid before school. The girl whose scraped knees I cleaned with iodine and a kiss. The girl whose university education I paid for by selling my own jewelry when the business hit a rough patch. 30 years ago, after a robbery in the neighborhood. Letitia had never known it existed. I found nothing. Only a 50-year-old woman hollowed out by ambition, with greed where her eyes used to have warmth and impatience where her soul used to be. Won't you even go in to say hello to your father? I asked, trying one last angle. Searching for one last crack of humanity. I don't want to wake him and upset him. They'll come for you both at 8 tomorrow. Be smart, Mom. Pack comfortable clothes. No junk. She turned toward the door. Oh, and leave the keys on the entry table before you go. The door closed with a quiet, definitive click. The sound of her engine fading into the rain mixed with the drumming of water against the windows. I was alone in the dim living room with that red suitcase. Empty, obscene, staring at me from the center of the Persian rug like an open coffin. I stood slowly. My bones cracked, but not from age. From tension. From the accumulated weight of something I had refused to see for years. I walked to Anselmo's room. There he was, my battle companion, breathing in that slow, wheezing rhythm. His face was calm, utterly unaware of the betrayal his own blood had just orchestrated in the living room. I took his hand, that large, calloused hand that now felt like paper. Don't worry, old man, I whispered into his ear, knowing he probably couldn't understand me. We're not going anywhere. Least of all to someone else's garden. I left the bedroom and walked through the house. My house. I ran my fingers along the doorframes Anselmo had sanded and varnished with his own hands. I touched the dining table where we had celebrated so many Christmases, where Letitia had blown out the candles on every birthday cake of her childhood. Every corner held a story. Every crack in the wall was a testament to our resistance. And she wanted to erase it all with a van and a suitcase. The indignation gave way to something colder, sharper. A clarity like a blade. Letitia was right about one thing. Anselmo had signed a general power of attorney 5 years ago, when the diagnosis became undeniable. He did it trusting her. Believing his daughter would protect our interests. So you don't have to deal with all the old paperwork, he told me with his usual gentleness. What a costly mistake. What naivety, to believe that love and good upbringing were any guarantee of loyalty. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. Black, no sugar, the way I liked it when I used to work late doing the hardware store inventory. I sat facing the red suitcase. I opened it. The inside smelled of new plastic. I pictured myself folding my blouses, choosing which photographs to take and which ones to leave behind for someone to throw in a dumpster. I pictured the faces of orderlies taking Anselmo away like a piece of old furniture. No, I said out loud. My voice bounced off the empty walls. I stood and went to the study, that small room at the end of the hall that Letitia rarely entered because she found it dusty and boring. There was Anselmo's old oak desk, covered in ancient invoices and tool manuals. But that wasn't what I was looking for. I went to the bookshelf where we kept encyclopedias nobody read anymore. I moved the volumes from A to C and reached into the dark gap behind the books. My fingers found the cold metal of a small safe embedded in the wall. We'd had it installed. I turned the dial. Right, left, right. The combination was our wedding date. The mechanism made a satisfying click, and the small door swung open. Inside there were no jewels, no stacks of bills. There were papers. Documents that Anselmo, in one of his last moments of absolute lucidity before the fog swallowed everything, had insisted we draw up. You never know, Prudentia, he had told me that night, his eyes wet but firm. The girl has changed. Money makes her crazy. If I'm ever gone or I can't decide for myself, I want you to have the final word. Not her. I pulled out the manila envelope. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I extracted the document. It was a revocation of power and establishment of a family estate trust, drafted by our trusted notary, Licenciado Benitez, an old friend who owed us more than one favor. The document clearly stipulated that in the event of any attempt to transfer, sell, or alienate assets by third parties, including prior power of attorney holders, absolute control of all assets, including the house and bank accounts, would revert irrevocably to my name, nullifying any prior authority granted to Letitia. But something was still missing. The document carried Anselmo's signature, shaky but legally valid, and the notary's seal. However, there was one final clause. An emergency activation clause that required my signature and today's date to take effect and be executed immediately before the registry. We had designed it this way to avoid hurting Letitia's feelings if it was never needed, to use it only as a panic button. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Tomorrow the van was coming. Tomorrow they would come for us. I found my fountain pen, the one I used to sign the hardware store checks. I sat at my husband's desk, feeling his presence behind me, lending me strength. She wanted a war, I murmured, uncapping the pen. She's going to get one. I smoothed the paper on the wood. I read every word again. Yes, it was all there. With this document, Letitia didn't just lose her power over Anselmo. She lost any right to make decisions about our home while I was alive. And there was something more. A second sheet I had almost forgotten. A modification to the will that reduced Letitia's inheritance to the legal minimum, and directed the remainder to a charitable foundation if she ever attempted to have us declared incompetent. The clock read 10 at night. The rain kept falling. But I no longer felt cold. I signed. I wrote my name. Prudencia Valdez de Montoya, in large, firm strokes that claimed every millimeter of space on the page. I wrote the date and time. Then I picked up the landline. I knew it was late, but Licenciado Benitez always worked past midnight. I dialed his private office number. Yes, came a hoarse voice on the third ring. Licenciado, it's Prudencia. Forgive the hour. Dona Prudencia, has something happened to Anselmo? Not to Anselmo. It's Letitia. She activated the plan. Tomorrow she wants to institutionalize us and sell the house. There was a silence on the other end, followed by the sound of a chair creaking. I understand. Do you have the document on hand? I just signed it. Good. Listen carefully. Prudencia. Tomorrow at 7 in the morning, I'll be there with my assistant and a locksmith, just in case. Don't open the door for anyone before I arrive. Not for anyone. Do you hear me? I'll be waiting, Licenciado. I hung up. A strange peace washed over me. I looked at the red suitcase in the living room. I walked up to it, closed it firmly, and stood it upright by the door. Tomorrow you leave, I told it. But you leave empty. I turned off the lights one by one, reclaiming my territory in the darkness. I checked that the back door was double-bolted. Then I went to the bedroom. I climbed into bed next to Anselmo. His warmth was the only shelter I needed. I kissed his rough cheek. Rest, old man, I whispered. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day. But we are not going to any nursing home. Tomorrow we're going to teach our daughter a lesson. I closed my eyes. But I didn't sleep. My mind sharpened every detail of the plan, honing the words I would say, rehearsing my posture. For years I had been a patient mother, a hard-working wife, a gentle woman who avoided conflict. But that woman had died the moment that Suitcase hit my living room floor. What remained in the darkness of that room was an old lioness protecting her den, and God help whoever tried to enter without permission. The night was not made for sleeping. It was made for sharpening knives. I didn't go back to bed after speaking with Licenciado Benitez. I sat at the head of the dining table in the semi-darkness with the document under my right hand and a cup of coffee going cold in my left. They say old age makes you fragile, thins your skin, softens your character. That is a lie. What old age does is strip away the distractions. When you're young, you worry about what people think, about keeping the peace, about being the self-sacrificing mother who forgives everything. But at 3 in the morning, alone with your truth, that woman disappears. I got up and went to the kitchen. Something made me check the trash bin. the one in the corner where Letitia had tossed a crumpled envelope before leaving, right after eating one of my apples without asking. I pulled out the paper, stained with coffee and apple peel. I smoothed it on the granite counter. It was a debt collection notice. Not in Anselmo's name. Not in mine. In hers. Letitia Montoya Valdez. The amount made me catch my breath. 6 zeros. A figure so staggering I had to read it 3 times. Gambling debts, or stupid investments, or the relentless cost of maintaining a life of appearances she couldn't afford. There it was, the real reason. Not love. Not concern for our health. Not even the fact that we were in the way. We were simply the liquidity she needed to keep from drowning. Our house, paid for brick by brick over 40 years, was her life raft, and to use it, she had to sink us first. A deep, visceral disgust dried up every tear I had left. "Very well, my dear," I murmured, folding the dirty paper and tucking it into my robe pocket. "If you want to play with numbers, let's play." I went back to the study. The revocation document was my shield, but I needed a sword. I opened the last drawer of Anselmo's desk, the one with the false bottom. Inside were the black ledgers. In the hardware business, Anselmo had always kept 2 sets of books, the official one for taxes, and the real one, handwritten in hardcover notebooks. Inside those notebooks was the true history of our family. I turned the yellowed pages to entries from 10, 15 years back. There it was, all of it. Loan to Letitia for the car. Never repaid. Payment of Letitia's apartment deposit. A gift. Money for Letitia's divorce. Gone forever. Anselmo had recorded everything in his sharp, orderly handwriting. I added the figures in my head. Accounting for inflation, Letitia had already spent her inheritance twice over. She didn't owe us respect. She owed us money. A great deal of it. And then I found something else, tucked between the pages of a 2018 notebook. A letter written by my husband when the Alzheimer's had barely begun nibbling at the edges of his memory. It was addressed to me. Prudentia, my life. If you're reading this, it's because I no longer know who I am, or because I'm already gone. The girl is not well. She has too much ambition and too little patience. Don't let her take the wheel. You built this empire of bolts and screws just as much as I did. You are the boss. If things get hard, use the Banco del Sur account. The password is your birthday. Don't tell anyone. Your old man loves you. The Banco del Sur account. I pressed my hand to my mouth to muffle the sound that tried to escape. I had forgotten it completely. Years ago, when the business was at its peak, we had opened a savings account at a branch that no longer existed, as a cushion for catastrophe. We never touched it. With compound interest over 2 decades, that account had to hold enough money to pay for private nurses, home care, and a trip to the sea if we felt like it. We didn't need Letitia's charity. We didn't need her to sell the house to cover our expenses. We were not poor. Not millionaires with yachts, but solvent elderly people who could afford their own dignity. That discovery changed my posture. Literally. My spine straightened. My vertebrae realigned. I was no longer the frightened old woman waiting for the van. I was the owner of the house. The majority partner of the marital estate. The matriarch. I spent the rest of the night in a silent, methodical purge. Not cleaning dust, cleaning my life. I went to my wardrobe. I pulled out the gray and brown dresses that Letitia always said were appropriate for my age, and dropped them on the floor. I reached to the back where I kept my occasion clothes. A navy blue wool suit I had worn to a niece's wedding 5 years ago. A cream silk blouse. Low-heeled leather shoes, firm and solid. I dressed slowly in front of the full-length mirror. I saw my wrinkled skin. My age-spotted hands. My white hair, which I usually wore in a careless bun. I let it down and brushed it 100 times, the way my mother taught me. I braided it into a crown, pinned with tortoiseshell clips. I applied makeup. A touch of blush to clear the pallor from my sleepless night. And lipstick. Red. Not a scandalous red. A serious, weighty brick red. I put on the pearl necklace Anselmo had given me when Letitia was born. It was heavy. That weight reminded me of my duty. I could not fail my husband. I could not allow them to take him from his bed like a piece of luggage to die among strangers. At 6 in the morning, the house smelled of fresh coffee and toast. I went to Anselmo's room. He was awake, watching the ceiling with that empty expression that sometimes broke my soul in two. But not today. "Good morning, handsome," I said in a strong, clear voice. No sympathy whispers. "We have visitors today. Let's get you looking sharp." I bathed him with a warm sponge and the patience of someone restoring a masterpiece. I shaved him with his classic razor, careful not to nick his paper-thin skin. I dressed him in his Sunday shirt, white, starched, and his knit vest. I combed his few remaining white hairs and spritzed his sandalwood cologne. "Where are we going?" he asked suddenly, with a flash of lucidity that lasted barely a second. "Nowhere, Anselmo. We're staying right here. But we're going to receive our visitors standing up." I sat him in his wheelchair and wheeled him to the living room, positioning him like a monarch presiding over his hall, facing the front door. I draped the plaid blanket over his legs so he wouldn't get cold. "Just watch me, old man. Whatever happens, you stay calm." At 7 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang twice. Short. Professional. I looked through the peephole. It was not the van. It was Licenciado Benitez. I opened the door. The man, nearly as old as us, but with a mind sharp as a blade, removed his felt hat when he saw me. He was accompanied by a tall young man with a leather briefcase, his assistant, and behind them, a broad-shouldered man with tools on his belt. "The locksmith." "Dona Prudencia," said Benitez, and his eyes widened slightly at my appearance. He had clearly expected to find a defeated old woman in a nightgown. Instead he found the owner of the hardware store, dressed for war. "You look formidable," he said. "Come in, Licenciado. The coffee is ready." We sat at the dining table. I spread out the papers, the signed revocation, the debt collection notice I had fished from the trash, and Anselmo's black ledger. Benitez reviewed everything in silence, adjusting his bifocals again and again. The only sounds were the scratch of his pen taking notes and the tick of the pendulum clock marking a countdown. "This debt notice changes everything," he said finally, his voice deep and measured. "This isn't just a question of preference or power of attorney. This proves bad faith. Conflict of interest. She wants to sell to cover her own debts, not for your benefit. With this, Prudencia, we don't just revoke her authority. We can request a patrimonial restraining order. We can seal this house so tightly that she cannot touch a single brick while you're both alive. And not even after, if we activate the foundation clause." "Do it," I said. The word left my mouth like a bullet. "Are you sure? This will permanently break the relationship with your daughter. There's no going back." I looked toward the living room where Anselmo was dozing in his wheelchair, unaware of everything, smelling of sandalwood and clean linen. I thought of the empty red suitcase by the door. I thought of the nursing home garden. I thought of my daughter walking across my Persian rug without removing her muddy shoes, not even bothering to look me in the eye. That relationship broke yesterday, Licenciado, when she decided we were unwanted in our own lives. I am not a burden. I am her mother. And if she has forgotten what that means, I am going to remind her. Benitez nodded, a crooked, satisfied smile forming under his gray mustache. "Fermin," he told the locksmith, "start with the back door. I want new industrial-grade deadbolts on every entrance. And you," he said to his assistant, "set up the camera and recorder. We're going to document the visit on video." "Video?" I asked. "Yes. If she tries to claim you're senile or under duress, the video will prove you are in full command of your faculties and acting of your own free will. We will record the entire proceeding. It will be educational." There were 15 minutes left before 8 o'clock. The rain had stopped, leaving a gray, heavy, motionless sky. I sat in my armchair next to Anselmo, crossed my legs with elegance, and folded my hands in my lap, interlacing my fingers so the slight trembling from my nerve endings would not show. Despite all my courage, my body still knew what was at stake. The red suitcase sat in the middle of the room, a monument to betrayal. I stood for a moment, went to the kitchen, took the house keys, the set Letitia had demanded I leave on the entry table, and tucked them into my brassiere warm against my skin. Nobody throws me out of my own house, I whispered to myself. Nobody. Then we heard it. The heavy diesel rumble of an engine approaching. Not Letitia's sports car. Something larger. Compressed air brakes hissed in front of our entrance. I looked at Benitez. He nodded from the corner of the room where he had positioned himself like a protective shadow. I looked at Anselmo. I looked at the door. For years I had been docile. A woman who lowered her voice to avoid causing trouble, who served everyone the bigger portion and kept the burnt ends for herself. But that woman was gone. She had left with last night's rain. The woman sitting in that armchair had a heart forged in iron and the memory of an elephant. I heard the van door slam. I heard Letitia's heels clicking up the front path. Quick, impatient, certain they owned the world. I heard her key enter the lock. The handle turned. The door flew open, letting in a gust of cold, wet air. "Mom, Dad, the transport is here," Letitia called from the threshold, not yet stepping inside, gesturing to two stocky men in tight white uniforms who followed behind her. They didn't look like geriatric care specialists. They looked like furniture movers in costume, with a bored, mechanical gaze of men who were paid per piece moved, regardless of whether the piece was a box of books or an elderly man with Alzheimer's. "Come on, we don't have all day." I took a breath, filling my lungs with the air of my home, my history, my truth. I did not move. I simply fixed my eyes on hers and waited for her to realize that the helpless old woman she had left behind yesterday had turned into a wall of concrete. She stepped inside. The moment her eyes found me, still seated, perfectly composed, dressed and painted and pearl-necklaced, with no trace of the frightened servant she had expected, she stopped. "For God's sake, Mom," she said, closing the door with her foot. "Why are you dressed like that? I told you comfortable clothes. That's a suit jacket. Do you think you're going to a wedding?" Her voice bounced off the walls, strident and irritated. She stepped toward me, then stopped midway, realizing I wasn't flinching. I hadn't stood to greet her. I hadn't smiled. I showed none of the cowering deference she was counting on. "Good morning, Letitia," I said. My voice came out lower, years younger than 78. The voice I used when negotiating with difficult suppliers at the hardware store. "You have mud on your shoes again." She glanced at the rug, exhaled sharply, and waved her hand as if my comment were the raving of an obsessive old woman. "We don't have time for your cleaning fixations, Mom. The van is double parked and these men charge by the hour." "You," she snapped her fingers at the two orderlies, a crude gesture she never learned in this house. "Go get the gentleman. He's in the wheelchair. Watch the porch steps." She turned back to me. "And you, Mom, grab your suitcase." The two men stepped forward. Their rubber soles squeaked on the waxed wood. "One moment," I said. I did not raise my voice. I simply released those two words with the weight of a court sentence. The men halted, confused, looking back and forth between my daughter and me. There was something in my tone, an ancient, settled authority, that their white uniforms could not ignore. "What now?" Letitia ran a hand through her ash-blonde hair, visibly strained. She checked her expensive wristwatch, probably paid for with money she owed us. "Mom, the admission is scheduled for 8:30. If we're late, they lose their breakfast slot and Dad gets impossible when he's hungry." "Sit down, Letitia," I said, pointing to the sofa across from me. "I'm not sitting down. We're leaving." I said, "Sit down." A thick silence fell. Anselmo let out a long, guttural sigh, as if underscoring my command. Letitia looked into my eyes, and for the first time since she'd walked in, She saw something that threw her off balance. Maybe it was the immaculate makeup. Maybe it was the pearls. Maybe it was the complete absence of trembling in my hands. Whatever it was, it made her hesitate. 5 minutes, she muttered, dropping onto the edge of the sofa without removing her coat, like someone granting an enormous concession. I made a subtle gesture to the orderlies. Please wait outside. They looked at Letitia. She nodded curtly, irritated by my control of the situation. Wait at the entrance, but don't go far. When the door closed and we were alone, my husband, my daughter, and I, the atmosphere shifted. This was no longer a medical emergency. It was a trial. But Letitia, in her arrogance, believed she was the judge, when in reality she was the defendant. So, Mom, what's the drama today? She asked, pulling out her phone and typing something quickly. Probably a message to her real estate agent. Are you having second thoughts? We already signed the center's papers. No refunds. It's a lovely place, honestly. They have activities. Bingo. Dance classes. I let her talk. I let her fill the silence with her polished lies. While she spoke about the wonders of the nursing home, I watched her. I saw the dark circles poorly covered with concealer. I saw the slight tremor in her right leg, that nervous tic she'd had since childhood when she was hiding something. I saw the desperation of a woman drowning in debt who saw us as her only lifeline. And the garden? I interrupted softly. You said it had a big garden. She blinked, surprised. Yes, of course. Enormous. With rose bushes and benches. Dad will love sitting there in the sun. And will you come visit us in that garden? Of course, Mom. Every weekend. The lie slid out of her mouth as smoothly as dirty water. I'll bring the grandchildren when they don't have football. But right now we need to go. The house. Well, the house needs to be empty today. Today itself. I played innocent, tilting my head slightly. I thought you were going to renovate it gradually. Letitia stiffened, tucked her phone away, and avoided my gaze. Yes. Well, the contractors are coming today to assess the damp and the pipes, you know. It's better with nobody in the way. For safety. There was that word. In the way. We were not her parents. We were obstructions of flesh and bone in a property of brick and cement. I stood slowly, smoothed my navy wool skirt, walked to the window, and pushed the curtains slightly further open. Morning light spilled in, illuminating the red suitcase still standing accusingly by the door. It's funny, Letitia, I said, keeping my back to her, looking out at the empty street. Last night I sat down and did the accounts. Accounts. Her voice sharpened. Became alert. Mom, forget that. You don't need to worry about numbers anymore. That's what I'm here for. That's what the power of attorney is for. I turned slowly. Yes. The power of attorney. The paper Anselmo signed when he could still tie his own shoelaces. I walked to the coffee table where I had placed Anselmo's black accounting ledger, closed but visible. You know, I remembered that the hardware store left us a decent nest egg. And I also remembered how much we helped you over the years. The car. The divorce. The beach apartment you had to sell. Letitia jumped to her feet. Her face had hardened. The mask of the concerned daughter was cracking by the second. That's the past. Bringing up old grievances now is pointless. I did it all for the family, and I'm doing this for the family, she said, pointing an accusatory finger at Anselmo. Look at him. He doesn't know where he is. He needs professional care that you can't provide. You're an old woman, Mom. Accept your reality. My reality, I repeated, tasting the words. My reality is that I am 78 years old, Letitia. Not senile. There is a difference. She snorted and walked toward the red suitcase. Enough talk. If you won't come willingly, you'll come the other way. I have the law on my side. I am the legal guardian. She grabbed the suitcase handle and yanked it upward with force, expecting to feel the weight of all my clothes and memories. The suitcase lifted off the ground with a ridiculous ease. It almost struck her in the leg from the force of her own pull. It was an empty shell, air-wrapped in red plastic. She froze, holding the suitcase suspended. She let it go. It fell with a hollow, mocking thud. "It's empty," she whispered. Then she looked at me with a fury that turned her face to stone. "You didn't pack. I told you clearly to pack." "I have nothing to pack, Letitia. Because I'm not going anywhere." Her face passed from red to white in a single second. She took 2 steps toward me, invading my space, using her height and her younger body to intimidate me. "Listen to me closely," she hissed, and in that moment the word mom disappeared from her vocabulary forever. "You have no choice. I've already sold the house, or rather, I signed a pre-sale contract. The buyers are coming at noon. They need to find it empty. I already spent the deposit, understand? There's no going back. If they don't get possession, they'll sue me for fraud. And if they sue me, I go to prison." She was breathing hard, her voice cutting through the room. "So you are going to get Dad and get in that van and go die quietly in that nursing home while I clean up the disaster that is my life." The confession hung in the air. Brutal. Final. There were no more doubts, no more assumptions. She had just tied the rope around her own neck. I felt an infinite sadness, not for myself, but for her. For how empty her soul had to be to sell her own parents for a deposit. But the sadness lasted only a moment. It was replaced instantly by the steel of my resolve. "So you already spent the money," I said, keeping my voice level. "And you need us to vanish so the bank doesn't find out the house isn't yours to sell." "It's mine in everything but the paperwork," she spat. "You two have already lived your lives. Now it's my turn." She turned to the door and flung it open. "Get in here," she screamed to the men outside. "Take them by force if necessary. She's senile. She doesn't know what she's saying." The 2 men entered this time with less hesitation. Money talks. Letitia had probably promised them a generous tip. One of them moved toward me with his arms spread, like he was herding livestock. The other went straight for Anselmo's wheelchair. "Don't touch my husband," I warned. "Ma'am, please don't make this hard," said the man approaching me. His breath smelled of stale tobacco. "It's for your own good. Your daughter has the papers." "My daughter has nothing," I replied, stepping back, not from fear, but to gain angle. He placed a hand on my shoulder. Firm, condescending, the kind of physical contact used to dominate without striking. "Come on, Grandma. Walk." In that instant, time stretched. I felt the weight of a stranger's hand on the fabric of my suit jacket. I saw Letitia at the far end of the room, smiling with triumph, believing that brute force and a piece of paper were enough to bend my will. I saw Anselmo stir in his wheelchair, sensing the threat, his trembling hands gripping the plaid blanket. That was enough. I shook the man's hand off with a sharp, violent movement that caught him completely off guard. "I said don't touch me," I said. And this time my voice was a thunderclap that rattled the glass in the display cabinet. "Nobody takes my husband out of this house. Grab her." Letitia shrieked. "She's hysterical. Sedate her if you have to." The man lunged toward me again, but I was no longer defenseless. I had stepped back to align myself with the hallway, right where the shadow from the living room swallowed the light. "Now," I commanded into the darkness of the hallway. Not a plea. An attack order. What followed was not the sound of my bones breaking, nor of Anselmo crying. It was the sharp metallic sound of a side door opening, and firm, heavy footsteps entering the scene. "Freeze!" boomed a male voice from the back of the hallway. Letitia and the orderlies spun around. Licenciado Benitez walked out of the shadows with the measured pace of a man who knows he is holding the biggest weapon in the room. He was not alone. His assistant held a video camera aloft, its red recording light blinking like an accusatory eye. And behind them, the locksmith, a man who looked more like a retired wrestler than a repairman, crossed his arms and blocked access to the rooms. "Who on earth are you?" Letitia asked, her voice trembling for the first time. "I am the legal representative of Senora Prudencia and Senor Anselmo," said Benitez, adjusting his glasses and advancing to the center of the Persian rug, placing himself between the orderlies and us. "And you gentlemen are currently committing criminal home invasion, attempted unlawful detention, and assault on vulnerable persons. All of which is being recorded and simultaneously transmitted to an external server." The orderlies released Anselmo as if he were on fire. They stepped back, hands raised, eyes locked on the camera with pure panic. They knew they'd lose their licenses, or worse, if this reached a judge. "This is ridiculous," Letitia tried. But her face had gone the color of ash. "I'm the guardian. I have power of attorney. They're incapacitated." I corrected. I stepped forward, reclaiming my place at the center of my living room, beside my lawyer, beside my husband. I felt myself grow 3 inches taller. "You had power, Letitia." Past tense. Benitez reached into his leather briefcase and produced the document we had signed hours before, the seal fresh and the ink still sharp in the morning light. "Act of revocation of powers and provisional measures of patrimonial protection," he read in a solemn voice. "Signed, sealed, and registered electronically at 8:01 this morning. You, Senora Letitia, have no authority over anything in this house. Not over the property, not over the people in it. In fact, if you do not leave these premises within the next 3 minutes, the police, who are already on their way, will remove you by force." Letitia stared at the document. She looked at me. She looked at the empty suitcase. Her brain was trying to process the reversal of reality. She had walked in as the mistress of the situation. Now she was a trespasser. But greed is a powerful drug, and she was too deep in it to surrender so fast. The confession hung in the air. Brutal. Final. There were no more doubts, no more assumptions. She had just tied the rope around her own neck. I felt an infinite sadness, not for myself, but for her. For how empty her soul had to be to sell her own parents for a deposit. But the sadness lasted only a moment. It was replaced instantly by the steel of my resolve. "So you already spent the money," I said, keeping my voice level. "And you need us to vanish so the bank doesn't find out the house isn't yours to sell." "It's mine in everything but the paperwork," she spat. "You two have already lived your lives. Now it's my turn." She turned to the door and flung it open. "Get in here," she screamed to the men outside. "Take them by force if necessary. She's senile. She doesn't know what she's saying." The 2 men entered this time with less hesitation. Money talks. Letitia had probably promised them a generous tip. One of them moved toward me with his arms spread, like he was herding livestock. The other went straight for Anselmo's wheelchair. "Don't touch my husband," I warned. "Ma'am, please don't make this hard," said the man approaching me. His breath smelled of stale tobacco. "It's for your own good. Your daughter has the papers." "My daughter has nothing," I replied, stepping back, not from fear but to gain angle. He placed a hand on my shoulder. Firm, condescending, the kind of physical contact used to dominate without striking. "Come on, Grandma. Walk." In that instant, time stretched. I felt the weight of a stranger's hand on the fabric of my suit jacket. I saw Letitia at the far end of the room, smiling with triumph, believing that brute force and a piece of paper were enough to bend my will. I saw Anselmo stir in his wheelchair, sensing the threat, his trembling hands gripping the plaid blanket. That was enough. I shook the man's hand off with a sharp, violent movement that caught him completely off guard. "I said don't touch me," I said. And this time my voice was a thunderclap that rattled the glass in the display cabinet. "Nobody takes my husband out of this house. Grab her." Letitia shrieked. "She's hysterical. Sedate her if you have to." The man lunged toward me again, but I was no longer defenseless. I had stepped back to align myself with the hallway, right where the shadow from the living room swallowed the light. "Now." I commanded into the darkness of the hallway. Not a plea. An attack order. What followed was not the sound of my bones breaking, nor of Anselmo crying. It was the sharp metallic sound of a side door opening, and firm, heavy footsteps entering the scene. "Freeze!" boomed a male voice from the back of the hallway. Letitia and the orderlies spun around. Licenciado Benitez walked out of the shadows with the measured pace of a man who knows he is holding the biggest weapon in the room. He was not alone. His assistant held a video camera aloft, its red recording light blinking like an accusatory eye. And behind them, the locksmith, a man who looked more like a retired wrestler than a repairman, crossed his arms and blocked access to the rooms. "Who on earth are you?" Letitia asked, her voice trembling for the first time. "I am the legal representative of Senora Prudencia and Senor Anselmo," said Benitez, adjusting his glasses and advancing to the center of the Persian rug, placing himself between the orderlies and us. "And you gentlemen are currently committing criminal home invasion, attempted unlawful detention, and assault on vulnerable persons. All of which is being recorded and simultaneously transmitted to an external server." The orderlies released Anselmo as if he were on fire. They stepped back, hands raised, eyes locked on the camera with pure panic. They knew they'd lose their licenses, or worse, if this reached a judge. "This is ridiculous," Letitia tried. But her face had gone the color of ash. "I'm the guardian. I have power of attorney. They're incapacitated." I corrected. I stepped forward, reclaiming my place at the center of my living room, beside my lawyer, beside my husband. I felt myself grow 3 inches taller. "You had power, Letitia." Past tense. Benitez reached into his leather briefcase and produced the document we had signed hours before, the seal fresh and the ink still sharp in the morning light. "Act of revocation of powers and provisional measures of patrimonial protection," he read in a solemn voice. "Signed, sealed, and registered electronically at 8:01 this morning. You, Senora Letitia, have no authority over anything in this house. Not over the property, not over the people in it. In fact, if you do not leave these premises within the next 3 minutes, the police, who are already on their way, will remove you by force." Letitia stared at the document. She looked at me. She looked at the empty suitcase. Her brain was trying to process the reversal of reality. She had walked in as the mistress of the situation. Now she was a trespasser. But greed is a powerful drug, and she was too deep in it to surrender so fast. "Change everything, young man," I told him. "Leave no crack through which betrayal can enter." I bent to pick up the red suitcase. It weighed nothing, but it carried the full weight of what had almost happened. I took it to the storage room at the back of the house and pushed it to the very back, behind the Christmas boxes. I was not going to throw it away. I was going to keep it there in the darkness as a constant reminder, a war trophy. I went back to the living room. And then Anselmo did something that stopped my heart. He turned his head slowly toward me. His eyes, normally veiled by the disease, had a flash of clarity, brief as lightning. He raised one trembling hand and pointed at me. "Bravo," he whispered. His voice was a thread of raspy air, barely audible. But the word was unmistakable. "Bravo, my boss." The tears I had not shed in front of my daughter, nor in front of the police, broke free. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. I went to him, knelt beside his wheelchair, and buried my face in his lap, breathing in the smell of sandalwood and clean linen. He stroked my hair with clumsy hands, the way he used to when we were young and I'd had a terrible day at work. We had won. We had lost a daughter, yes. That wound would be slow to heal, if it ever healed at all. But we had kept our home, our patrimony, and the most important thing, our dignity. Nobody was going to treat us like old furniture. Nobody was going to uproot us from our soil. The Banco del Sur account was secured within days. Benitez took me to the main branch, arm in arm, dressed once again in my navy suit, walking not like a widow in waiting but like the matriarch of an empire. The bank manager's eyes widened with renewed respect when he saw the balance Anselmo had been quietly building for decades. With a firm signature, I transferred the funds into an irrevocable trust. Ironclad clauses. The money was exclusively for Anselmo's medical care, for my own maintenance, and after our deaths, the remainder would go in full to a foundation providing legal aid to unprotected elderly people. And for your daughter, Senora Montoya? The young manager asked, reviewing the paperwork with barely concealed curiosity. My daughter already received her inheritance during our lifetime, I replied, looking at him over my glasses. What remains here is dignity. And dignity is not something you inherit. It's something you build. The house that Letitia had described as a ruin in need of selling bloomed under my command. I hired a renovation company, not just anyone, but the sons of our oldest hardware store customers. Honest men who remembered Anselmo giving them loose bolts as boys. They fixed the leaks, painted the facade a warm cream color, and built the garden. Letitia had lied about the nursing home garden to convince me, and that lie had planted itself in my mind. If my old man wants a garden, I thought, he'll have the finest garden in the neighborhood. We tore out the weeds from the back patio, planted rose bushes, hydrangeas, and a lemon tree, because Anselmo had always loved the smell of citrus in the morning. We built a smooth wooden ramp connecting the bedroom directly to the patio so his wheelchair could glide over it without catching. And I hired Carmela, a sturdy, cheerful nurse with an angel's hands and the patience of a saint, who came every morning to help with the heavier aspects of Anselmo's care. The rest of the time, the care was mine. I fed him his soup. I read the newspaper to him, even though he only looked at the pictures. I played his bolero records. Letitia tried to return. Of course she did. Rats always come back when they're hungry. It happened 2 months later. The phone rang on a rainy afternoon, much like the one she'd brought, the red suitcase. I recognized her number on the display. My hand trembled for an instant before I picked up. But my voice came out steady. Yes. Mom, it's me. Her voice sounded broken, distant. Every trace of the arrogance was gone. They repossessed my car. They're evicting me from the apartment. I'm living in a motel by the highway exit. I have nowhere to go. Please, I just need a little help to start over. I swear I've changed. I closed my eyes. I pictured the little girl whose hair I used to braid. But then I pictured the empty red suitcase. The van waiting outside. The coldness in her eyes when she told me the house was already sold. You have your health, Letitia, I said, hardening my heart like the steel of the nails we used to sell. You have 2 hands and 2 legs. You have the education we paid for. Use them. You witch, she hissed, and the victim's mask fell away instantly. I hope you die alone. I won't be at your door, Letitia. And don't come to my funeral. You're not invited. I hung up softly. No slammed receivers, no shouting on my part. Only the silence of someone who has amputated a gangrenous limb to save the body. She never called again. Word trickled through the neighborhood, as it always does, that she had moved north with a friend to escape her creditors, that she was working as a hotel receptionist, that she had aged 10 years in 6 months. I felt no joy at that. But I felt no guilt either. I felt justice. The time I had with Anselmo after that was a gift I stole from destiny. He lived another 18 months. 18 months that Letitia had wanted to trade for a week in a gloomy care home. We spent those months in our garden under the lemon tree. He didn't speak much, but he smiled. He recognized me. He knew he was in his home. He felt the sun on his face and the taste of my lentil soup. He died on an autumn afternoon, asleep in his bed, clean sheets smelling of lavender, his hand in mine. No tubes, no machines beeping, no strangers in the room. He left in peace, in the sanctuary I had defended with every bone in my 78-year-old body. When he exhaled his last breath, I did not weep in desperation. I wept in gratitude. I had kept my promise. Nobody takes you from here, old man. And nobody did. The funeral was full. Neighbors, old customers, Licenciado Benitez, Carmela the nurse, everyone came. Everyone except Letitia. Her absence spoke louder than anything she could have said. I stood beside the coffin dressed in perfect black, head held high. I was no longer just Prudentia, the ironmonger's wife. I was Prudentia, the woman of iron. After the burial, the house felt enormous. The silence that had been my ally threatened to become my executioner. Loneliness is dangerous at 80. It can convince you that your purpose on earth is finished. But then my gaze fell on the red suitcase. I had moved it to the hallway closet. I took it out. I set it in the middle of the living room, exactly as Letitia had left it that day. I opened it. Empty. No, I said out loud. I am not going to fill you with grief. The next morning I called Benitez. Licenciado, activate the foundation. But I want to make a change. I don't want to be a posthumous donor. I want to work. Work. Donor Prudentia? At your age you should be resting. Traveling, perhaps. I'll rest when I'm with Anselmo. Right now I have too much to do. There are many women out there, Benitez. Many widows, many frightened mothers who have vulture children and sick husbands. They don't know how to read the fine print. They don't know they have power. I'm going to teach them. That was how the Prudentia Refuge was born. Not an office or an elegant building. My own living room. I started small. A neighbor whose daughter was trying to take her pension. I invited her for coffee, reviewed her papers, called Benitez. We won. Then another woman came, and another. Word spread in the neighborhood. Go to Donor Prudentia, the one with the garden house. She doesn't back down. She knows. I became a kind of informal guardian of the elderly women in the neighborhood. They brought me their bank letters, their confusing wills, their fears. I served them coffee with biscuits I baked myself, because the kitchen kept me alive. And I told them the truth without anesthetic. Don't sign that. Change your lock. Your son loves you, but he loves your money more. I learned the law. I learned to use a laptop I bought with my savings. I learned to write emails that made lazy notaries shake in their chairs. My mornings filled with purpose. I no longer woke thinking about my aching joints, but about my 10 o'clock appointment with Senora Gertrudis or Senora Amelia's lawsuit. And Letitia never knew that half the foundation's income went to scholarships for law students specializing in elderly rights protection. She never knew that her greed had planted the seed of an army of lawyers who would protect other parents from children like her. That was my final revenge. The sweetest of all. Converting her cruelty into a shield for others. Some nights, when the house is quiet and the wind stirs the branches of the lemon tree, I think of that afternoon. The van. The suitcase. It was the most painful moment of my life. It was the ultimate betrayal. But it was also my awakening. If Letitia had not set that suitcase at my door, I would have gone on being the meek old woman, the silent wife, the blind mother. I would have died slowly, consumed by routine and submission. Her cruelty forced me to find my strength. It forced me to remember who I was before I became anyone's mother or wife. I was Prudentia. And Prudentia does not surrender. Now, when I see a woman my age walking down the street with her eyes cast down, carrying heavy bags, invisible to the world, I want to stop her. I want to take her by the shoulders, look her in the eyes and say, listen to me. You are not in the way. You are not a piece of old furniture to be stored in a corner. You are the foundation. You are the owner of the house. And if anyone at all, tries to tell you otherwise, show them your teeth. Old age is not a defeat. It is a conquest. We have survived illness, crises, childbirth, loss. We have hard skin and long memories. I am Prudentia Valdez de Montoya. I am 82 years old. I live in my house. I sleep in my bed. I am the master of my own destiny. And that red suitcase still sits in the back of the closet, empty in the dark, reminding me every single day that I came to this life and to this house with hands full of work, and I will leave only when God decides. with hands full of victory. The wiser the old woman, the fiercer the fight. And God help whoever dares to forget it.